Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition, and we turn now to poem 373, I'm Saying Every Day. Now, this is a fascinating little poem. It will play around with speculation. When we get to poem 696 for Emily, it will be acres of perhaps. And she imagines a simple question. What if I woke up tomorrow and I was a queen? Now, the fact that she's going to mention queen here will take us back to our reading of poem 285. The robin's my criterion for tune, because I grow where robins do. But were I cuckoo born, I'd swear by him. The ode familiar rules the noon. The buttercup's my whim for bloom, because where orchards sprung. But were I Britain born, I'd daisies spurn, nut but the nut, October fit, because through dropping it the seasons flit, I'm taught. Without the snow's tableau, winter were lie to me, because I see New Englandly. The queen discerns like me providentially. Now, the fact that she mentioned the queen, and here we're going to get the queen again, in this poem of 285, buttercups mentioned, and in 373, buttercups mentioned, we are back to one of Emily's comparison poems. Now, our assumption is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've worked through our set of introductory comments. I'm hopeful that you've worked through our preceding 372 poems. We just finished with 372, I Know Lives I Could Miss. Now, when this poem was published in the Atlantic Monthly in November of 1935, it was titled, If I Should Be a Queen. And as we say, there's a comparison here. In other words, what does it mean to be a queen versus not a queen, as in a subject of some kind or another? Now, the scholar Ruth Miller has pointed out that maybe here we've got Emily is musing on what would it be like to finally be accepted within that pantheon of important poets. Or, some have argued, no, to be a queen in this poem is actually to finally have the return of favors, love, desire, either from Sam Boyles or Sue or any number of other people. This is the way she says it. I'm saying every day, if I should be a queen tomorrow, I do this way, and so I deck a little. If it be I wake a bourbon, none on me bend supercilious with, this was she begged in the marketplace yesterday. Court is a stately place, I've heard men say, and so I loop my apron against the majesty with bright pens of buttercup, that not too plain rank overtake me, and perch my tongue on twigs of singing rather high, but this might be my brief term to qualify. Put from my simple speech all plain word, take other accents as such I heard, though but for the cricket just, and but for the bee, not in all the meadow one accost me. Better to be ready than dead next morn, meet me in Argonne, my old gown on, and the surprised air rustics wear, summoned unexpectedly to Exeter. Now, some scholars have pointed out, this may be, of all the poems that we will read of Emily Dickinson, this may be actually Emily's closest experiment with free verse. And you could even hear in my reading of the poem that it had resonances, for example, of something we read when we were studying the poetry of Walt Whitman. We did all of the poems of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. We call that series Talks with Walt. Here, of course, Chats with Emily. And this is a very chatty poem. Notice that she begins by speculating. I'm saying really means I'm speculating or I'm imagining, right? Perhaps, again. I'm saying every day. In other words, I ask myself, if I should be a queen tomorrow. Now, of course, this word queen is a loaded word. She uses it in 19 of her poems. Again, we already mentioned 285 in her use of the word queen. In other words, she imagines herself somehow a subject, somehow not of that royalty, that is to say, of that higher echelon. What would it be like to switch places? In some ways, of course, we think about Burns's to a louse, oh, that he would give us some power he would give us to see ourselves as others see us. In other words, Emily's always playing this game of perception, perspicacity as we've used the phrase. In other words, trying to see through multiple perspectives. What would it be like to be totally different from the person that I am now? What if I woke up tomorrow and I was completely different? Let's say, for example, that I was a person of tremendous power, right? What would that be like? She'd say, I'd do this way. And then right away she'd start thinking about clothing, right? We'll get to gowns in a second and aprons and all of that. And so I deck a little, if it be. I wake a bourbon, in other words, the Queen of Aragon in France, right? None on me bend supercilious. We'll see this as well in poem 585 and 950 with, quote, this was she begged in the marketplace yesterday. Now her use of the word begged is fascinating. And I think that Ruth Miller's onto something when she reads this poem as, this is Emily speculating on what it would be like to finally be recognized as a real poet, as a serious poet. And in that regards, not someone that has to beg for attention. When we see this word beg, we think of poem 59. We'll see it again when we do poem 494. When we get to poem 1314, we'll come back to her use of this, but in poem 1314, she says it this way. When a lover is a beggar, abject is his knee. When a lover is an owner, different is he. So notice the differentiation between beggar and owner. What he begged is then the beggar, oh disparity, bread of heaven, resents bestowal like an obligity. I think this poem helps us to read the poem that we're dealing with here. There seems to be a certain kind of almost resentment of the fact that Emily perceives herself as someone who has to beg in the, notice, market is capitalized place yesterday. Now, some have equated this with her reading of Tennyson's The Beggar Maid, and of course those stories about individual poor women in the marketplace or whatever that are picked up and then they marry into some kind of important place. Obviously, as we've spoken about, Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre comes to mind immediately. Rochester, of course, is going to snatch up Jane and in marrying her, give her some kind of status. Notice, though, the word begged here is something she says that is said by other people about her. Was that she, this was she that begged in the marketplace yesterday. Then she goes to the idea of court. And if you're reading this poem, some of you probably will, as Emily is thinking about the fact of how hard it is to be accepted into that pantheon of important poets. Obviously, we go back to our Dante and our study of Dante, where he will, in limbo, you'll remember, he will write himself into the poem, Dante the writer and Dante the pilgrim, and there will be that observation, is that the great Dante the poet, the Florentine poet? Dante longing for some kind of recognition. Here it's, court is a stately place. And then there's this, I've heard men say. Now, you know, this kind of, this is one of the reasons we call our discussions chats with Emily. I've heard men say this, right? Court is a stately place. I would know because I've never been there. In other words, I don't know what it's like to be a well-known poet. I don't know what that's like. I don't know what it's like to be an Emerson, for example, or a Longfellow, or a Tennyson, if you will. So I loop my apron, we're back to clothing again, against the majesty with bright pens of buttercup. We're back, of course, again to poem 285 with the buttercups thing. That not too plain rank overtake me. In other words, when rank overtakes me, I'm not too plain. This idea of being a beggar and being plain. In other words, I'm just a normal person, but if I was a queen, I'd have to somehow reckon with the fact people might not recognize me as the queen. They'd see me as too plain. And now we go to some bird observations. Perch my tongue, notice capitalize on twigs, notice capitalize of singing rather high, but this might be my brief term. Notice all the T words here, to qualify. I think the key word of this poem here is probably brief. That is to say, for a brief moment in time, what would it be like to be the bird that's singing in the highest branch and singing the most brilliant tune? Put from my simple speech, right, all plain word. Notice how she comes back to the word plain. Take other accents as such I heard, though but for the cricket. No, notice from daffodils down to cricket. Just. And but for the bee, not in all the meadows. So we go from courts to meadows. One accost me. Hey guys, I think Emily's doing something very profound here as she's doing this little speculating game. What would it be like to have the freedom to be a poet that is recognized as a poet? Maybe Elizabeth Barrett Browning standing in the back of her mind. She says about this speculation, better to be ready. In other words, there's a notion that one must always be prepared. Then did the next morn meet me in Aragon, my old gown on. We're back to this idea of dress, and of course Emily's notion of how she would dress for much of her reclusive years, as we've pointed out already, and the surprised air rustics wear. Again, we're back to the idea of the rustic New Englandly from 285. By the way, rustic only gets used one time only in all of her poetry, and it is here. Summoned unexpectedly to Exeter. Exeter takes us back to poem 138. We said there, right, that it kind of represents the nobleness of English. Of course, there is that whole story of the legend of the earl that marries the humble village maiden, and we can think about that motif as well. Unexpectedly, I think, is a key word here. In other words, what if all of a sudden I was unexpectedly discovered? What would that be like? I wonder if people would be able to accept me. I wonder if I would know how to behave. At 2A, I think the theme or the message here is that it's hard to know how you would respond to a radical change of status, where all of a sudden you are something other than what you were before. How would I deal with that? At 2B, as we've said, there's here a classic example of some potential free verse. There's as well a number of examples that we could point out of key poetic terms, right? Think of it. Alliteration, be, bourbon, bend, begged, all in stanza 2. Tongue, twigs, term, as we said in stanza 4. Meadow, morn, meet, me, my, all in stanzas 5 and 6. And then how about the assonance of saying, day in line 1, be, queen in line 2, stately, place, say, plain, overtake in stanza 2, better, ready, next in stanza 6. And then of course you can hear the consonants as well. Stately, place, say, so, loop, apron, pens, plain, all in stanza 3. Then morn, Aragon, gown, on in stanza 6. Surprised, air, rustics, wear, and of course Exeter in stanza 7. So Emily's doing the full symphonic game here. And yet, I think the challenge is how you read this poem in terms of tone. See, I think a lot of times Emily plays the game. I wonder if they would see beyond my plainness, and it's evident that Emily already thinks of herself as a queen of a kind. In other words, I'm a queen, you just don't know it. And it seems like there's a certain kind of movement on a spectrum between, on the one hand, self-doubt, and on the other hand, a confidence that allows Emily to say, I am a queen. They just don't see it. They don't get it. And of course, we think of Keats here, especially, right, when I have fears that I may cease to be, then on the shore of the world I stand alone and think, till, what does he say, love and fame to nothingness do sink. Emily's grappling with the whole idea of fame, to be the queen. Finally, to own a poem like this, when was a time that you were somehow told, either directly or indirectly, you're the queen? In other words, somehow status changed. A student once saying, you know, I wasn't in the in group, and then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, I became part of that group, and I was made very uncomfortable by the fact that all of a sudden I was now on the inside of a group that I had always looked at with a bit of askance. Thank you.